If you're a regular Geek's Guide to the Galaxy listener, please rate and review us using your favorite podcast app. And I want to give a special thank you to Martin Kilbinger, who gave the show this 5-star review on Podcast Addict. This insightful podcast let me discover so many books, movies, and authors that I didn't know before. The host is always well prepared. He has a large variety of interesting guests, and the interviews are thoughtful and entertaining. So big thanks again to Martin Kilbinger for that great review. Alright, so now let's get to our show.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 547 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. I'm David Barr Kirtley, author of the book Save Me Please and Other Stories. Publishers Weekly writes, visceral settings and robust characters will have readers marveling at how much Kirtley is able to fit into a limited page count. For SFF fans with no time to sink into a doorstopper, these concentrated doses of genre goodness will hit the spot. So again, the book is called Save Me Please and Other Stories, and it's available now on Amazon.com. And our guest today is Ian Livingstone, co-founder of Games Workshop, the legendary UK game company behind Warhammer 40,000. He's also well known as the co-creator of the fighting fantasy game books, which combine branching storylines with dice-based combat. And in this interview, we'll be discussing his new book, Dice Men, the origin story of Games Workshop. And now here's our interview with Ian Livingstone. All right, so we're here with Ian Livingstone. Welcome to the show.
Hello there.
Okay, and so your new book is called Dice Men, the origin story of Games Workshop. So how'd this book come about?
Well, we started Games Workshop in 1975, a long time ago, obviously, and more and more being asked, so what was the origin story of Games Workshop? Now it's a company well known to everybody, worth £4 billion, some $5 billion on the London Stock Exchange, and clearly focused on Warhammer and sit on miniatures and White Dwarf magazine, phenomenal success story. But as I said, more people want to know, how did it all begin? And that's Dice Men actually tells that story.
You say in the book, writing this book about events which happened over 40 years ago has been a sentimental, if not surreal, experience. So what do you mean by surreal?
Just meeting people we haven't seen in literally decades, looking at old photographs I hadn't looked at for 30 years and wondering just how we actually managed to do it, because clearly there was no internet. We couldn't get access to finance. The bank manager wasn't interested in lending us any money. It was just a couple of hobbyists trying to turn their hobby into some sort of fledgling business. So we must have jumped over many hurdles, but I guess because there was virtually no competition at the time, we were able to fail without going broke.
Yeah, well, and you had a couple of strokes of incredibly good luck, including, so you're starting out, you're just sort of operating this little games business, sort of board game business out of your apartment. Yeah. And you get the opportunity to be the exclusive European distributor for Dungeons and Dragons, which was just starting to get popular. So yeah, that was quite a good fortune.
Yes,
there.
Lucky. We were in the right place at the right time, but as they say, you make your own luck. We grasped the opportunity and ran with it and sacrificed everything to make it happen and successful. We'd ordered 6 copies of Dungeons and Dragons, and on the back of that order, we got the exclusive European distribution agreement for the whole of Europe for 3 years. I guess it's because Steve Jackson and I were both role-playing as businessmen about a role-playing game, and Gary Gygax was doing the same with his 2 business partners at the time, the Bloom brothers.
I mean, is there any more to say about why they gave you this exclusive deal? Did they think that would motivate you to put all your energy? Or
I think they liked the idea of having a European distributor because they're a very small company as well, and clearly our the size of our order was paltry, but it didn't matter. They could say that they had a European distributor, and we got on. We were all gamers and getting very excited about a game that was a milestone in gaming history and would have an incredible impact on the whole gaming world over time.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned going through the old photographs and things, because this book is just full of photographs and flyers and stuff like that. Like, what was it like assembling all that stuff?
Well, I've always been a bit of a collector. I mean, I'm sitting right here now in a room full of some 1,500 board games, hundreds of video games, all my Fighting Fantasy game books that I wrote, all the foreign editions. And I've kept a lot of stuff from the early days. I always thought it's important to keep something that might one day be, if not historically important for the nation, would be nice to look back on over time and play those kind of remember when evenings. So I kept a lot of photographs, manuscripts, the very first order that we got for Games Workshop, which was an order for some wooden games. And also got in contact with some of our early employees that also kept photographs. So it was great fun trying to assemble it. As you say, there's over 400 photos and images in the book. And it's really a kind of, in many ways, a kind of personal memoir rather than a business book. It's all about the trials and tribulations of that early journey and how we might have failed several times for whatever reason.
So were there any of those photos that you look back on, you're like, wow, I had completely forgotten about that, or that I never thought I would get my hands on this, but it turned up?
Well, most of them were from Steve or my own collection of 35 millimeter slides, some out of White Dwarf magazine, old photographs that we kept, and some from our compatriots of the time. But there were some that I was so pleased to have had taken at the time and being able to hang on to them, the ones we are with Gary Gygax and traveling around the States and the opening of the Games Workshop first retail store and all those big nostalgic moments, which were just impactful, not just for Steve and I, but for the games hobbyists to look back on now as they read Dice Men.
Yeah, that was one of the most memorable parts of the book for me, was your first kind of road trip around the U.S. So you say you were inspired by Jack Kerouac's On the Road to do that?
Yeah, well, we were going to meet Gary Gygax at the Gen Con in 1976 to finally meet him and also sign up any fledgling companies that were happening to be at Gen Con. But we thought, having never been to the States before, we might as well make a holiday as well as a business trip out of the journey. So we delivered cars, and back in the 70s, you could go to delivery agencies and get like 8 days to cross the States. So our first one was from New York over to Los Angeles. And then we got another up from LA to San Francisco. We hung out in Berkeley for a month or so. Enjoyed all that kind of craziness that was happening there. And then another one over to Chicago. And ultimately we got to Lake Geneva, Wisconsin to attend Gen Con. But we had loads of fun on that trip. It was a McDonald's Olympics, as we called it. It was 1976. And McDonald's were giving away these coupons that scratch off coupons. So if any event that United States had a gold, a silver, or a bronze medal success in, you'd win either I think it was a Big Mac, fries, or a Coca-Cola. So we were cheering on the United States to win all the medals, feeling a little bit actually British at the time. It was ridiculous. So we traveled a lot across the States because of our ability to get free McDonald's, and there's some amazing times going to the Grand Canyon and breaking down the Mojave Desert and going to Vegas and seeing gambling in a way we'd never seen it before. And I say, ultimately, our road trip ended in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin.
And it seems like you've done a lot of traveling. I mean, you mentioned that Thailand and Corfu and these places you've traveled all kind of found their way into your books.
Well, I love travel. I mean, it's a great, not only a personal experience, I think it's the education that you get from meeting people from different nations, going to different parts of geography and climate is all kind of enriching in multiple ways and has a big impact on your imagination. So I use that as a source for some of my Fighting Fantasy books, as you say, going to Thailand in the early 1980s when it was very much different than it is today, and going on a trek on the northern border and being worried about being attacked by bandits came over the border from Burma and going to see these Stone Age hill tribes gave me loads of ideas for perhaps one of my most popular game books, Death Trap Dungeon.
So when you planned that trip, did you know about the bandits, or was that kind of a surprise?
No, I had no idea. I mean, I'd gone on my own and flown to Bangkok and then got a train up to Chiang Mai, then a truck up to this little place called Phang, which happened to be near the Burmese border, and met these 3 English nurses who said they were going to go on this trek, and they'd hired this Thai guide who said he wanted to take us up into the north and even right near the Burmese border, where there was lots of Stone Age hill tribes people still there living off the land, and the watering holes he was always worried about, because the previous week some bandits had come over the border and held up a group of German tourists, and apparently the tourists refused to give up their camera and was shot for his trouble. So it was quite interesting.
Wow. But so some of you say like Fang and the River Cock, those all showed up in Death Trap Dungeon, just those names exactly as you experienced them.
Yeah, and the characters and the illustrations were very much from photos I took as well of the people.
I mean, Death Trap Dungeon was a very formative book for me. I think I maybe mentioned over email that one of my earliest pieces of fiction I wrote was this sort of slavish imitation of Death Trap Dungeon. It was called The Labyrinth of Death Cave. And right. I pulled it out last night and I was looking at it, and there's something in it called the Blood Beast, which is ripped straight out of Death Trap Dungeon. But my version, it's actually made out of blood. So I guess as a kid in my mind, a Blood Beast is just a monster made out of blood.
I think I better make my next monster made out of blood. Because it's the 40th anniversary of Death Trap Dungeon next year, and of course, a lot of people have asked me to write a sequel to Death Trap Dungeon, so I'm kind of toying with the idea right now, but it's a lot of work, and it doesn't get any easier, but it's still great fun to try.
Yeah, no, I just loved it so much as a kid. And I mean, I guess you said that was a pretty common experience, right? That a lot of kids really, connected with those books and it got them into reading and stuff like that.
Yes. Well, Fighting Fancy came about really through Games Workshop, because we used to run these events called Games Day, and Penguin Books attended with a trade stand, and the editor, Geraldine Cook, was bemused and fascinated by several thousand people getting very enthusiastic and animated about playing D&D at Games Day. And she asked Steve Jackson and myself whether we'd be prepared to write a book about the hobby of role-playing. And we said, well, rather than writing a book about the hobby, why don't we write a book that allows you to experience role-playing? And she thought that was a really good idea and said we should write a synopsis, which we duly did. And so we came up with this Fighting Fantasy concept, which is a branching narrative with a game system attached to it. Quite a kind of taking the appeal of role-playing, but putting it into book format, replacing the Dungeon Master with a book of multiple choice, but having a lot of choice in terms of 400 number paragraphs, a combat system, rolling dice to fight the monsters, keeping a record in an inventory of all the items and treasure that you find on your route. And unless you found a key in one room, you won't be able to open a door in another room, and so on. So ultimately there was hundreds of ways of going through the book, but only one correct way. But it took a long time for Penguin Books to make up their mind to actually publish the book, because apparently when Geraldine presented the idea to the managing director, he laughed so hard that he hit his head on the table, saying that there's no way anyone's going to play or read through an interactive book. Books were a linear medium and should remain so. But she fought our corner, and ultimately they were published by Puffin Books, which is their children's imprint. But they also allowed us to use our own Games Workshop artists for the covers and the internal illustrations, which they were worried about because they wanted nice, safe covers, with a little gnome and a toadstool and butterflies. And we wanted covers that threatened to rip the faces off the reader, which was very, very exactly what the kids wanted, because they're not scared by this stuff. They can compartmentalize fantasy, and they love having their imagination stimulated by such vivid illustrations of that we had in Fighting Fantasy game books. So they were a phenomenal success over time. They sold over 20 million copies, published in over 25 languages and over 35 countries. They were published originally in the US by Dell. And they had considerable success everywhere. And they're still in print today, which is amazing that they survived the test of time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've heard some people talking about them as sort of a precursor to grimdark, the grimdark movement in fantasy of sort of dark, gritty fantasy like Game of Thrones and Joe Abercrombie and stuff like that. Like, what do you?
Well, they've had a significant influence on a lot of games and films, I believe, and they. Miyazaki-san, the designer of Dark Souls, for example, credits Fighting Fantasy with inspiring him as a kid to want to become a games designer. And as you know, Dark Souls was a huge success. And there's other examples of people who've become really successful in TV production or writing, and artists that all credit Fighting Fantasy because it had such an impact on people's imagination at a younger age. It's that agency of control and choice that is so powerful rather than being a passive experience when you read a linear book. It's an interactive book that gives the player choice to control the story as they want to go through it. And so, whilst some of the books were criticized for their content, the kids themselves really enjoyed it because of that. It was all about them rather than reading about somebody else's exploits and adventures. So they were hugely successful.
Yeah, I mean, it was sort of striking looking back at my Labyrinth of Death Cave that reading Death Trap Dungeon not only made me want to read, but made me want to write in emulation of it. And so many of the books that I read in school didn't want to make me want to do either. So it makes you think maybe there should have been more books like Death Trap Dungeon that we were assigned to read in school.
I think it also speaks to the power of play that people often criticize video games and all sorts of interactive entertainment as being trivial at best and probably harmful, rather than understanding the power of play that given that, I say, the agency of control is really compelling. You're required to problem solve in a video game or a game book. You learn intuitively. You increase your critical thinking. It increases literacy. I would say they're a contextual hub for learning, and that often is not recognized in mainstream media of the good that comes from playing games and reading books like Fighting Fantasy.
Yeah. Now, so I had the perception like I said, I absolutely loved Death Trap Dungeon, but I had the perception, at least when I was a kid, that it was absolutely impossible to survive if you actually tried to follow the rules. And
well, it's okay. I mean, I used to see people on public transport with their multiple fingers stuck in the pages. I used to call it the 5-fingered bookmark, as I saw people on trains, etc. But that's okay if you want to peek around the corner, shall we say, politely, what you're doing. But it is possible to get through. There are lots of people who do keep going until they finally get their way through. Obviously, if you play it several times through, you're going to get a lot more information than just going blindly into rooms without having any prior information. But they are possible to complete, I promise you.
I mean, it is fair, I guess, that a book called Death Trap Dungeon would be something where you die a lot.
Well, the clue is in the title, isn't it?
But did you have like when you were designing it, did you think like, oh yeah, this is going to be brutal and like half the fun or is just seeing what horrible way you're going to die? Or like, how did you think about game balance as you were designing them?
The fun for me in writing them is luring people to their death, promising great riches only for them to fall on poison spikes in deep pits. So I try to put as many red herring choices in as possible and try and keep them away from the one true way. But the thing is about human beings is that they are very happy to fail. It makes them more determined to succeed next time. And if you made them too easy, they kind of, that wasn't very challenging. If you make it too hard, that can be annoying. So it's finding that balance between simplicity and difficulty to a kind of that kind of Zen curve of accessibility. But most people very happy to go into the dungeon many times, fail many times, but ultimately kill the blood beast and get through and out with the treasure.
Mm-hmm. So in addition to Death Trap Dungeon, the other two that I remember really vividly were Rebel Planet and Chasms of Malice. And I was just curious if you have any...
I can't really speak to those because neither of those were mine. My most popular ones were, apart from Death Trap Done, were City of Thieves, Forest of Doom, Island of the Lizard King, and more recently Shadow of the Giants, which came out last year. But City of Thieves usually gets voted as as people's favorite books. It was based in Port Blacksand, this sort of awful place in West Atlantia, which was habited by thieves and brigands and thugs and pirates and evildoers, and the ruler of Port Blacksand was kind of evil personified. The quest was to go into Port Blacksand to meet this old retired wizard who'd gone to live there, so people wouldn't bother him because he thought that no one ever would dare go to Port Blacksand to find him. So ultimately you have to find him to learn how to defeat Zambarbone, the night demon. And people seem to enjoy wandering around the rich world of Port Blacksand. So that's always been perhaps my first or second favorite, as has been the fans.
Mm-hmm. So the ones that were written by other people, everyone kind of did them independently, or was there any? Did you interact with the other authors?
Well, I wrote my own. Steve wrote his own, and then we could not keep up with the demand because we were running Games Workshop during the day, which was a growing business. It wasn't just Dungeons and Dragons now; it was Citadel Miniatures, White Dwarf magazine, on new board games, and ultimately Warhammer. At the same time, we were having to go now to our respective homes and write Fighting Fantasy game books. And Penguin, well, their Puffin brand, were now completely full on in understanding that they had a kind of international global hit franchise on their hands and were demanding more books. So they were wanting one every 2 months, which was impossible to do. So we got guest authors in. So we would see a synopsis, approve the synopsis, and let the authors write theirs, two of which you just mentioned. So that's how we satisfied the demand. But yeah, because Workshop was growing really crazy. I mean, in the early days, it was a tiny business. When we came back from the States in 76, we had nowhere to live. We had to live in Steve's van because we couldn't raise any funding through the bank manager, who looked at us as like we were insane to say we wanted a loan to build a company based on a role-playing game called Dungeons and Dragons. There was no games market as such in those days, so we had to do everything out of cash flow, which was very slow. But you know, we were still as massively committed games players and fans of the genre, and so we did everything from work around the clock to beg, borrow, and steal to help make our business grow.
You know, so I read Dice Man, and then I also read this other book called You Are the Hero by Jonathan Green. It's a history of fighting fantasy. So I had a couple of quotes in there, but one of them is there's this guy, Peter Darville Evans, and he says, Stephen Ian had a rags to riches story that was a publicist's dream. And it was sort of making me think when Harry Potter first got really big, you know, I always heard that, you know, it was written by this woman and she'd been a single mother on welfare and now she had this big series. And I felt like that rags to riches story was a big part of what attracted people to to checking it out. And I was just curious what role you think your rags to riches story might have had on getting people interested.
That might have had an impact. Clearly, you know, I came from, and Steve came up from very humble backgrounds, in Manchester, very poor background. But I think people are more intrigued that we were not just entrepreneurs starting a business with no affiliation to the product. We were absolute big games fans and players. So it's that being able to turn a dream hobby into a business, which I think is so appealing. And they know we're real games players. We're not kind of just jumping on the bandwagon. And we forged an industry in its very early days from nothing to what is now a global phenomenon, both tabletop games, video games, which is a $250 billion a year industry, 3 billion people playing video games. I've been working in the video games industry for the past 30 years and have no intention of retiring. Life for me is a game, work and play is the same. I enjoy every minute of it. I love the people in it. I love the games, of course. And I think people understand and are pleased to know that we are games players like them at heart and will always remain so.
Yeah, definitely. I think anyone reading this book who's sort of like a role-playing game geek is sort of, can live vicariously through you guys and be like, this is, the ultimate fantasy life for a role-playing fan.
Well, I think I said recently I'd rather be a nerd than follow the herd. It's being able to. The thing is, we never did anything for money. We wanted to start a business without even thinking whether it would be successful or not, or thinking about whether or not we will benefit from it. Ultimately, its success will come if you do it right. And, we did it right and we benefited from that. But that wasn't the initial motivation. It was to build a business around our own hobby.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many points in the book where you persevere in the face of hostility or skepticism. I mean, you described being on a talk show one time and the host asks you, when are you going to write a proper book? This is after the fighting fantasy books have hit the bestseller list.
That was funny. It was a TV show called Saturday Superstore here in the UK. And I was asked to come on to talk about the top 10 books in the children's bestsellers list. And being interviewed, we started at number 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. And when we got to 3, 2, 1, they were all mine. And he said, what's this an interactive book? It was kind of a bit dismissive. And then he said, as you say, when are you going to write a proper book? And my reply is, well, if children are reading them, it doesn't matter if it's a comic or a Final Fantasy game book. They are reading. And they might get onto proper books when they're ready. But if their gateway to enjoy reading is Fighting Fantasy, what's not to like?
Yeah, I mean, I think the game book format is just an amazingly powerful format. I mean, one person in this book makes the point that it sort of combines the best aspects of a video game and a book. That you have the interactivity of a video game, but then you have the sort of personal imagination. What he had a good phrase, like the dream fueled fantasy or something like that. I think there's so much you can do with that format.
Yeah, and it was realized by teachers quite early on how good they were for people in terms of not just improving their literacy and critical thinking, but that enthusiasm for reading, and then that transposed into them wanting to create and write their own adventures, like you said you did yourself. It really enabled creativity either as an illustrator or as a writer, and to express themselves and feel a confidence from succeeding to navigate the adventures, whatever they are, whether it's managed to get through Desktop Dungeon alive, or finding Nicodemus in City of Thieves, or finding the Warhammer in Forest of Doom. People really enjoyed immersing themselves in those worlds and participating as though they were actually there.
Yeah. Also, some of this satanic panic stuff you talk about was just just to give people an idea, listeners an idea. There was one woman who called into the radio and said that her son levitated in the air after reading a fighting fantasy book. Another person was interviewed on television and said that her child had the mark of the devil on his body, and when she threw the book into the fire, the mark of the devil disappeared. And there was also apparently an Anglican vicar who threatened to chain himself to the building, insisting that the books be withdrawn from publication. So
the petition sent in by parents worried that their children were using their imaginations too much by reading these books. I mean, that is insane. You want your child to have a good imagination, because creativity and imagination is what differentiates ourselves from the robots. And if the robots are going to take over any job that involves repetition, there's no point in training them like robots because they won't be able to compete with the real thing. So creativity and imagination is a thing that differentiates us as human beings. So you want them to have a good imagination as possible, I would argue.
Just what was it like for you just living through that period of time? I mean, it just sounds like such a weird thing just to have to deal with.
Well, it's like if people don't understand what it is, they tend to get concerned by it and suddenly think it's going to be the end of society. I mean, it happened with comics, it happened with rock and roll. Whatever phenomenon comes along, it usually seems to be a threat to society until the next one comes along and the establishment understands that it's not so bad after all, and actually it's actually quite good. But it just takes society a long time to understand new things, I think.
Because that's completely disappeared now, right? Like nobody today has any issues with fighting
Not at all. Everyone thinks they're amazing. They go, hey, my kids are reading. Thank you.
Yeah, it's just so weird to me how these moral panics will just sweep through society and then just fizzle out. And then it seems really rare that anyone ever says, oh, I was wrong. Maybe we should learn from this experience, or, can't believe we did that. It just seems like people just prefer to forget that they ever acted that way. But it wasn't
as the panic wasn't as bad as perhaps it might be today because there was no internet at the time. So it couldn't catch fire. There was kind of more local fires than national fires sweeping the nation as a result of people jumping on the bandwagon in social media.
I mean, even stuff like there was a book that was called House of Hell, and the name had to be changed to House of Hades, and Crypt of the Necromancer had to be changed to Crypt of the Sorcerer. And today you wouldn't have any problem having Hell or Necromancer in the title of a YA book, I wouldn't think, right?
I wouldn't have thought so, no. House of Hell was Steve's book, and it wasn't changed in every country, by the way. It remained
just in the US, I think.
Yeah, perhaps.
I mean, so one of these things I thought I'm just kind of interested in how the books are sort of designed. And there's a quote here from Paul Mason I thought was interesting, where he says, I should point out that I learned from my mistake with the Crimson Tide and deliberately built in multiple victory paths and different levels of victory in subsequent books. So that's kind of interesting to me that since this was such a new art form, I guess you were sort of learning as you went with each book.
Well, they're all different. Some have multiple endings that end in success. I usually have just one success route and lots of failure routes. Not always insta-deaths, but you don't succeed in your mission and you're really encouraged to try again. But there's no one true way other than the basic system for using skill, stamina, and luck, and the combat system and structures. But sometimes we add new rules to each book. Like Steve often would add perhaps a magic system into one book, or move the genre outside of heroic fantasy into superheroes or horror or road movie or whatever that might be. But I've nearly all my books have been based in Lancia, which is kind of the world of a connected world of my books in a geography that is mapped out.
I can remember, as a kid, I never had this book, but I would see pictures of it in the backs of some of the fighting fantasy books. But there was this one called Titan, the Fighting Fantasy World. Yeah. And on the cover, it has this dragon attacking a castle. And on the far side of the drawbridge at the gate, there's sort of this last stand by humans, and there's like wizards and pikemen and stuff like that. I always just thought that was one of the coolest pieces of fantasy art I'd ever seen.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's done by Chris Achilles. Sadly, he passed away not too long ago, but he also did the cover for our other source book called Out of the Pit, which was a collection of monsters. So Titan was a book about the world of fighting fantasy, its economy, its legends and lore and characters and currency and climates and all that stuff. And Out of the Pit was just a book of monsters taken from most of the Final Fantasy game books. But I say both covers were done by Chris Achilles, who was an amazing artist, and he did several covers for me for my individual books as well. But art played such an important role in Final Fantasy. The very first book in the UK, the internal illustrations were by Russ Nicholson, also sadly, who passed away. But perhaps my favorite artist in Final Fantasy was Ian McCaig, who did the covers for the UK covers for Forest of Doom, Deathstrap Dungeon, City of Thieves, and Island of Lizard King. He also did the internals for City of Thieves and Deathtrap. If you saw the cover, the UK cover of City of Thieves, you see Zambar Bone, the main protagonist, with his spiked cranium. And Ian McCaig then went to Hollywood and worked for George Lucas and came up with Darth Maul, which surprisingly who also has a spiked cranium. And I would also argue that they are distant cousins, thanks to Ian McCaig.
Yeah. One of the pieces of art, I guess it was Ian McCaig from Deathtrap Dungeon that has really stuck with me just for, 40 years, whatever, was there's this one of a skeleton sitting on a throne, clutching a parchment, and there's just something about that image. I guess they used it on the cover later, but I just always thought that was such a striking.
That was a later cover from the second publisher. That Ian McCaig had the Blood Beast on the original Puffin cover, and the one you were talking about was when it was published by Wizard Books, and the artist was, testing my imagination, I can't actually remember. It'll come to me, I'm sure, before the end of the interview.
Yeah. I guess for readers who haven't read Deathtrap Dungeon, do you want to talk about what the Blood Beast actually is? Because it is not actually a monster made out of blood.
No, I just Deathtrap Dungeon, Blood Beast. I like my alliterations often, clearly. And the Blood Beast is this multi-eyed monster that sits in this pool of acidic kind of gunge, and it has a long barbed poisonous tail and a very long tongue, and will ensnare you and sting you and drag you into its pool, where you can effectively rot away in the acid of the pool, so it can consume you in liquid format. But it does have a weak spot in that all the numerous eyes it has on its face, one of them is, if found with a knife, will effectively kill it instantly. So you just have to find which is the correct eye to pierce, basically. But people love the Blood Beast for many reasons, and it's one of my favorite monsters. Yeah,
definitely reading commentary online, the Blood Beast has a certain level of celebrity, it seems like.
Yeah. That's in the Shape Changer, which was on the UK cover of Forest of Doom, was also a very popular one.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if I could find the quote. There was a quote I had from you where you listed some of the characters and places and things that had been most popular in the fighting fantasy universe. Oh, wait, here it is, actually. I might mispronounce some of these names. Characters like Zagor, Yastromo, Balthus Dire, Nicodemus, Baron Tecumvit, Lord Azur, and Throm. Places like Firetop Mountain, Darkwood Forest, Port Blacksand, Fang, Trolltooth Pass, and Kakabad. So yeah. Those are kind of when you meet fighting fantasy fans, those are some of the things that they tend to be most excited about.
Yeah, they've really become established in lore and fondness in people's minds, having been around for such a long time. I mean, Zagor was the original warlord of Firetop Mountain, so he's been around, getting a bit long in the tooth. Firetop Mountain first came out in 1982, and Yastromo was the wizard who you encounter at the beginning of Forest of Doom, who gives you advice and help, but do not try to think you can take advantage of him, or you will suffer for doing so.
Yeah, I just feel like the names and places and titles in the fighting fantasy universe, they're just so evocative. They just, Forest of Doom, all those titles, they just make you want to read the books so much. It really...
Spend a lot of time thinking of names to describe a moment. and try and make a promise to what the reader might expect.
Yeah. So what was it like? So what was it like writing the more recent fighting fantasy books? Like, has your approach changed at all, or like, what's it like coming back to the series and writing these more recent? I'll give people the titles. Wait, where is it? Well, Shadow of the Giants, that was one. Port of Peril. Yeah, just those recent books. What's it been like working on those?
Yeah, the other one I did was Assassins of Valencia. It was no different at all in terms of the way of writing, other than to replace the pen and ink, which I used to write longhand with using a computer and a Word doc. Obviously, that makes editing a lot easier, but the structure and methodology of doing it remains the same, in that I have 400 numbers ready to allocate as I design on the fly. So I have a basic story arch in mind and some protagonists and monsters in mind, and then set off. So number one, and then it splits out to, if you want to go one way, go to 22. If you want to go the other way, go to 104, and cross those off the master list, and keep a record of the branching on a flow chart, rather like a computer flow chart, and making notations of all the encounter points and what you might find where, and make sure there are no kind of cul-de-sacs, and that the economy is balanced and it's not too difficult, not too hard. And also going back into along the multiple paths. So if you can find a key, and you need a key to open the locked door, you have to go back and put the key in a room where you might find it. And so there's a lot of back and to, and an awful lot of cross-checking. And it's still a nightmare thing to have to do, but very enjoyable to finish, and even more enjoyable to get feedback from the fans.
Yeah, we'll talk more about the fan community, because there's actually a fighting fantasy convention, right? That happens regularly.
Yeah, it's every 2 years. The last one was last year for the 40th anniversary, Fighting Fantasy Fest 4. The next one will be 2024, the beginning of September in London. And it's a chance for the fans who've been probably buying and become collectors and fans of the books for over 40 years, and some new people as well, of course. And some of those older fans bring their children along. So it's to meet the authors, and Steve and I in particular, and some of the artists and some of the people who have been involved in the world of fighting fantasy. And it's a really great time. And so we have people coming from all over the world, from Taiwan, even from Australia, the US, just to take part in a celebration of fighting fantasies. We really, really enjoy it.
This book I read, again, it's called You Are the Hero, A History of Fighting Fantasy. It's written by this guy, Jonathan Green, who's actually written a bunch of fighting fantasy books himself, but he's a super fan. I mean, you can just tell reading this book. I mean, he knows everything, just loves it. He
probably knows more about it than we do, but I mean, regular communication with Jonathan, and he has written a few fighting fantasy game books. We're actually collaborating on a book right now called Magic Realms, which is it's the art of fighting fantasy. So all the amazing art that's appeared, and both the covers and the black and white illustrations we're putting into one volume, rather like Dice Man. It will also be published by Unbound as well, to become another reference book of fighting fantasy, but celebrating the art and the artists, which I don't think have always got the praise they deserve.
Yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about Unbound? It's described in the book. It says Unbound is the world's first crowdfunding publisher. You want to talk about that?
Well, they specialize obviously in book publishing. Everyone knows about crowdfunding platforms like Kickstarter, has done so well for the games industry in particular. But Unbound specialize only in books, and that's you put a proposition up on their website, and with a target amount to achieve before it gets the green light to go ahead, and it will go into production. So it's kind of de-risking the proposition and allowing the book to go ahead. So it's the fans from all over the world can participate by pledging the book to be published, and it's been a great success story. I mean, Dice Man was funded very early on, as has Magic Realms. So we're very happy to be working with Unbound in this capacity.
Yeah, and Dice Man has a big list in the back of all the crowdfunders. Yeah. And, so I guess that's cool. If you back the book, you can get your name in there. And it's the same thing for Magic Realms. Is that still ongoing? People could back that still?
Oh, it's still available. If you go to the unbound.com website, you'll be able to pledge for just the book itself, or some of the other pledges that give you some rewards that you might want as a collector. And it's already funded, so it will happen. But anybody else is more than welcome to join. It doesn't close off like other crowdfunding platforms until it's close to going to print.
So what has it been like working with Jonathan Green on the new book? Like, how is that different from, because you wrote Dice Man yourself pretty much? I mean, I guess Steve contributed some material as well.
Yeah, but Steve's not been well. And so I took on the bulk of the writing of that. He gave me a couple of things to include, obviously photos as well. But, we've been business partners since 1975. So it's important that the book came from both of us. But I did most of the writing of that book. And with Magic Realms, my main role has been to provide all the illustrations. I mean, obviously Steve and I own the trademark and copyright in the brand of fighting fantasy, and also own the rights to an awful lot of art that was produced in the early days. And so I'm a source for the art, and Jonathan's been doing a lot of the biographies of the artists and working with some of the artists to get their approvals and consent. But I'm really excited about it because it's not just the art that happened, it's some of the art, the sketches that led to the covers, and some of the more interesting stuff that people don't know about when putting a book together, and how you work with artists. So it's kind of demystifying that relationship between the authors and the artists.
Yeah, and that book will be out in 2024, you said?
That's right. Yeah, I say it's already funded. It's probably 3/4 written, and it's just a question of formatting and deciding which of the literally thousands of pieces of art we should actually put in the book, and what the people would like to see most. Yeah,
no, I'm really looking forward to that because I just loved these fighting fantasy books as a kid, and I'd actually I had looked it up a number of years ago and saw that there's actually an app. So I'd actually gotten Death Trap Dungeon on an app. And so I had, kind of messed around with it a little bit at that time. But then just this week, my wife and I went through and played Death Trap Dungeon. And it's kind of cool to have it on the app because then you can...
Well, the only frustrating thing I'm sure you've noticed is that you can't cheat very easily with the apps. But it must be good fun playing. And if you like Death Trap Dungeon, there was also an interactive narrative version that's available from Branching Narrative Limited. I think it's you get it on PC and Steam, and I think now on smartphones, where somebody's actually reading it to you, and you make the choices. And there's a very famous actor who's fronting it called Eddie Marsan, and the stats are at the side of the screen, so you can, it's like an interactive storytelling time listening to Eddie narrate the choices to you, which has really been enjoyed as well.
Yeah, that's really cool. I mean, this app I got was called Fighting Fantasy Classics, and we definitely cheated a lot. So it definitely, this one, I think there's different modes, like sort of difficulty levels you can choose, but we chose one where you can place a bookmark anywhere you want, and then save your game and go back. So we were dying left and right, but we still made it through.
You enjoy cheating, that's fine with me.
I also saw there's like a fighting fantasy. It's called Fighting Fantasy Adventures. It's like a cooperative card game that's in development.
That is in development. That's being done by Martin Wallace, who's a a really well-known games designer. He's got the #1 game on BoardGameGeek.com called Brass. He's a prolific board games designer, and he loves Fighting Fantasy. So he got in touch, and he's developing a cooperative card game, essentially based on 4 of the books, which we'll be talking about today. And there's also a German company, it hasn't been announced yet, who are in the process of developing a board game. So there's still a huge amount of interest in the brand. They've also signed options for a couple of TV things that have not been announced yet. So it's just great that they're still relevant and loved 40 years on.
Yeah, no, that's really cool that that so much stuff is happening with Fighting Fantasy right now. I didn't, until I read Diceman and kind of researched it, I didn't realize all these things were going on. So that's really exciting. I guess I have a couple just other random things I wanted to ask you about. So you mentioned in the book that you once did 84 interviews in 3 days. So
yeah,
what was that like?
That was what I think we call frantic. It was incredible. At the time, it did become an international phenomenon. When Steve and I went to Japan to work with our Japanese publishers, and we actually got mobbed at some of the signing sessions there, with everyone bringing huge lines of people, all bringing little gifts. And by the end of the signing session, the table in front of us got piled high with gifts, which we didn't know what to do with because we were traveling around back to Japan. But the one you mentioned was a tour of New Zealand and Australia, and it was just crazy, moving from the TV studios to newspaper offices to radio stations and signing sessions, and it was just like every 20 minutes we were off to somewhere else, and God, it was a whirlwind. But it was amazing. I mean, it's just a phenomenon. But you don't actually realize at the time just what a phenomenon that Fighting Fantasy was, because, say, there was no social media, so we're kind of like in a bubble. Our fans knew about it, we knew about it, but not many other people knew about it.
So when you do 84 interviews in 3 days, is it like the same questions 84 times in a row, or were they?
Mostly. You had to keep your enthusiasm going, try and make them a little bit different. It was a time when Death Trap was launching, so yeah, it was a lot of questions about the Blood Beast, and still are.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm guilty of that one. But so then was it kind of when the internet came around that you started connecting with that you started hearing from the people that you sort of knew that these books were on the bestseller list, but then you actually started hearing from them or meeting them? Or
yeah, it's been great to be able to connect to a community which otherwise we would never have had any interaction with, and it's great to hear how much they're deeply loved by a lot of people who say they kind of saved them during dark times of their childhood and encouraged them to become the people they are today, and how they enabled the people to make decisions and gave them confidence and self-worth, and kind of really inspired them to be somebody that they thought they might never be. So it's great to hear all that, and we feel very humbled to hear it. And yeah, it's brilliant.
One other thing I thought was interesting was that the first Fighting Fantasy book, Warlock of Firetop Mountain, comes out, and it's not really being supported by the publisher and doesn't sell particularly well initially. And then you guys go on BBC Radio 1. So talk about that.
Well, Penguin didn't really know what to do with them. I mean, they looked like normal books. The fact that they were interactive was hidden to the salespeople who just kind of put them into retail and hoping for the best. So they didn't start off selling very well until Playground Power, the word of mouth of the day, spread the word as schools became linked through people from one school talking to kids in another school saying how amazing these books were. But that didn't really come about until, as you say, we appeared on Radio 1, where we read out the choices on air, and people would phone up the station, BBC, and give their answers. So we were playing a live Warlock of Firetop Mountain over on the radio, and that really sparked everyone's imagination. an interactive story where the audience makes the choice.
And I would guess at that time, if you're on BBC Radio 1, a significant chunk of the country is listening to that, right, at the same time.
Big audience. It was incredibly powerful and amazing opportunities to get people to know about Fighting Fantasy game books, and suddenly they were sold out all around the UK. Every bookshop suddenly had empty shelves and reorder. But Penguin didn't really believe in it even then, and they reprinted about 11 times in the first 2 months until they finally said, "Can we have 2 more, please?" And then Steve wrote Citadel of Chaos and I wrote Forest of Doom.
Do you think, people talk a lot now about the fragmentation of the media, and you don't have these things that everybody's watching all at the same time. I wonder is that harder, do you think, for something like that to happen now, or maybe because of stuff can go viral on the internet, it kind of balances out?
Well, there's so much stuff and so much noise on the internet. It's hard to get traction with any audiences. So you need big influence, I would say, to make new things happen these days. We were just very fortunate that nobody else was doing this at the time when we launched, and we got, say, the help from BBC promotion and then the power of the word of mouth in the playgrounds. And then Penguin really got behind it big time once they realized they had a hit on their hands. How
did the BBC appearance come about? Did you know somebody there, or did they hear about the books, or like kind of?
No, that was through the marketing department of Penguin. So there was a couple of people who actually got it and ran with it.
I guess that maybe the last thing I wanted to ask you is there's a part where you say you go to Hungary. You say it was still the era of the old Iron Curtain, and I remember our trips to Budapest were interesting to say the least. I was just curious what was interesting about the trips to Budapest. Well,
this is the part in Diceman when I talk about designing the launch video game for a company called Domark, which ultimately I joined when we sold out of Games Workshop, and Domark metamorphosed into Eidos, and I became chairman of Eidos, and we launched Lara Croft Tomb Raider in 1996. But backtrack to 1984, when I was asked to design this game called Eureka, because Death Trap Done was number 1 on the bestsellers chart, and these 2 founders of Domark came knocking on my door and said, would I do that? And I said, yes. But there was a £25,000 prize for the first person who could solve the puzzle in Eureka, which was ultimately a phone number, which led to an answer machine in a solicitor's office. And if you phoned that up and left your name and address and phone number, you would win this £25,000 prize. So to stop everyone finding out how it could be done, we had it programmed in Hungary in secrecy. So we had to navigate the Iron Curtain and have it programmed there. So it was always fun because it was strange times then, and kind of strict regime, but the people themselves were wonderful.
It's funny. It almost sounds like a Mission Impossible or something, keeping this solution secret to the game.
Yeah, but we did it because not all the clues were in the program itself. Some were also in the rule book, and the illustrated rule book. So there wasn't an easy answer to the problem.
Yeah. All right. So we're pretty much out of time. So I guess we should start wrapping this up. Were there any other? Did you have any other final thoughts, or were there any other projects you wanted to let people know about?
No, I think that's fine. Thank you very much. I mean, I hope Diceman gets the love and praise that it has happened in the UK, as happens in the USA and Canada, of course.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed reading it. I mean, I found out so much that I didn't know about the history of Games Workshop. So that was really, and I just love, finding out, the history of these kinds of things. And also, like I said, it's sort of this ultimate fantasy for a role-playing fan to read about this life of
happy days, days on the road, making it up as we went along, all great fun. We probably made many mistakes, but we weren't punished for those mistakes.
Yeah. So it's a great book. Highly recommend it. And so again, we've been speaking with Ian Livingstone about this new book, Diceman. So Ian, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Ian Livingstone for joining us on the show. This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy was made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please support us on Patreon over at patreon.com/geeks or via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. Alright, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.